What if I told you that Mercedes-AMG Petronas Formula One team could have found a way to gain time in qualifying without technically breaking the rules? Because that is exactly what the FIA is investigating right now, and the situation is much more serious than it seems. A hidden trick in the hybrid system, a loophole in the 2026 regulations, and an advantage that could have made key differences on the grid until it all exploded. The most shocking thing is not that it has been banned. The most shocking thing is that it could have been used from the beginning without anyone saying anything. Are we facing another engineering masterpiece, or a case that could end in a sanction? Because what the FIA has discovered completely changes the rules of the game. The problem doesn't start with a trap. It starts with an opportunity. A small crack in the regulations that only the most advanced teams are able to detect. And in this case, both Mercedes-AMG Petronas Formula One team and Red Bull saw something that the rest overlooked. A technical exception that, used at the perfect moment, could become a brutal advantage in qualifying. To understand it, you have to go into the heart of the 2026 regulation. The FIA had designed a very clear system. The power of the MGUK had to be reduced in a progressive, staggered, controlled manner. It wasn't a whim, it was a matter of security. Without the MGUH, the behavior of the engine changes completely, and a sudden delivery of power could generate dangerous differences between cars. Everything was thought out, except one thing: the exception. In case of failure, the system allows the MGUK to be turned off instantly. From 350 kilowatts to zero in a single moment. Something extreme but necessary in critical situations. And this is where the genius appears, or the controversy. Because that exception was not intended to be used strategically, but it was not completely armored to avoid it either. Mercedes found the perfect timing. In a qualifying lap, each sector counts, but there is a key point: the end of the straight before crossing the finish line. That is where much of the time is defined. What they would have done is maintain maximum electrical delivery for longer than allowed, and just before crossing the line, activate that emergency shutdown. The consequence? The 60-second penalty that blocks the system. But at that point it no longer matters, because the return has already been made, and the pilot enters the cooling phase. It's a surgical move. It does not affect the fast lap. It does not penalize immediate performance. And the most important thing, it doesn't literally break the norm, but it does twist it to the limit. This is where everything starts to escalate. Because as soon as other teams, especially Ferrari, detect strange patterns in the telemetry, alarms go off. We are not talking about a minimal difference. It is estimated that this maneuver could provide extra power at the most critical moment of the lap. And in Formula One, that's the difference between starting first or losing an entire race before it starts. The FIA comes into play, first with doubts, then with pressure, and finally with a decision: prohibit the immediate use of this system starting in Miami. But that's not what's really important. The really important thing is that the FIA does not stop there. He decides to investigate. Because now the question is no longer whether it is legal or not. The real question is, how long has it been in use, and how much has it changed the game without anyone knowing? Because if Mercedes-AMG Petronas Formula One team used this system in multiple classifications, then we are not dealing with an isolated technical detail. We are dealing with something that could have altered grid positions, race strategies, and even final results. And in Formula One, that is extremely delicate territory. The FIA knows it. That is why the investigation does not focus solely on banning the trick. It goes much further. What they are seeking now is to reconstruct exactly how, when, and how much this procedure was used. Telemetries, engine maps, MGUK activations. Everything comes under review. Because each activation at that specific point in the lap could be direct evidence. And here appears the real problem for Mercedes. Because although the system took advantage of a legal exception, the intention behind it is what is under scrutiny. The FIA not only regulates what is written, it also regulates the spirit of the rule. And if you consider that this emergency shutdown was deliberately used as a performance tool, the narrative changes completely. It is no longer innovation. It becomes exploitation. And when Formula One enters that field, history has shown us that the consequences can escalate very quickly. From retroactive technical directives to sporting sanctions if it is determined that there was an unfair advantage maintained over time. But there is another factor even more tense: the paddock. Because while the FIA investigates, the other teams are watching and putting pressure. Ferrari has already taken the first step by pointing out the irregularities. And when one team opens that door, it doesn't take long for the rest to fall in line if they feel they've been competing at a disadvantage. This turns the situation into something political. It's not just Mercedes against the FIA. It is Mercedes under the gaze of the entire grid. And at this point, the team's silence also begins to say a lot. Because there is no clear defense, there is no forceful denial, only an immediate adaptation after the ban. And in Formula One, when a team stops using something from one day to the next, it's usually because they know exactly where the limit is. The most disturbing thing is that the investigation is still open. And the more time passes, the more data is analyzed, the more pressure builds, and the more the possibility grows that this will not simply end with a ban. Because if the FIA finds what it is looking for, this could change not only a classification, but the complete perception of the championship. Because if the investigation confirms that Mercedes-AMG Petronas Formula One team used this system deliberately and repeatedly, Formula One faces an uncomfortable scenario. One in which it will have to decide to what extent it is willing to punish intelligence when it crosses the line of the regulations. This is where the real dilemma comes in. If the FIA does not act firmly, it sends a dangerous message, that finding loopholes and exploiting them without real consequences is part of the game. But if you act harshly, you open another, even more complex front. Because you would be punishing something that technically was not explicitly prohibited at the time of its use. And that completely divides the paddock. On the one hand, teams that feel they have been wronged will demand justice. Because in qualifying, where everything is decided by thousands, any artificial advantage changes the natural order of the grid. And that has a domino effect. Better position, better strategy, better results. On the other hand, there is the historical argument of Formula One. Innovation has always come before the regulations. Always. And many within the sport will argue that this is just another example of engineering taken to the limit. But there is one detail that changes everything. The intention. Because if the FIA demonstrates that this system was not an accidental consequence of the design, but a tool planned, optimized, and executed with millimeter precision, then it is no longer a gray area. It becomes a crossed line. And at that moment, the possible consequences are no longer theoretical. Formal warnings, more severe technical restrictions, and even sporting sanctions cannot be ruled out. Not because the system was illegal in itself, but because its use could be considered contrary to the spirit of the regulation. And here comes the most important thing of all. This doesn't end with Mercedes. This redefines the limit. Because from now on, each team is going to look at the regulations differently. Every engineer is going to ask themselves how far they can go. And the FIA, after this case, is going to toughen its stance against any creative interpretation. The real consequence is not a penalty. It's a change in the game. One where innovation will continue to exist, but under much stricter surveillance. And meanwhile, one last question remains in the air. Was Mercedes the only one to use it? Or was it simply the first to be discovered? And in the end, this whole story leaves us with a reality that goes far beyond a simple technical trick. It leaves us with a clear warning about where Formula One is headed. Because what began as a brilliant interpretation of the regulations by the Mercedes-AMG Petronas Formula One team ended up provoking a direct reaction from the FIA that now not only seeks to curb that advantage, but to understand if a line was crossed that should not be touched. There are no blacks and whites here. There is a gray area, increasingly dangerous. On the one hand, the essence of Formula One has always been this: find what no one sees, exploit every void, push engineering to the limit. But on the other hand, when this creativity begins to directly affect sporting equity, the FIA is forced to intervene, and it does so by marking territory. The ban was just the first blow. Research is the real message. Because now all teams know that it's not enough to be smarter. You also have to be more careful. The margin between innovation and sanction has never been so fine. And most importantly, this does not stay in 2026. This changes the mentality of the paddock. From now on, each technical solution will be observed with a magnifying glass. Every suspicious advantage will be questioned. And each team will know that even if something isn't explicitly prohibited, it doesn't mean it's allowed. The FIA has made something very clear. The regulation is not only complied with, it is also interpreted. And in that interpretation, it is decided who wins and who pays the price. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.